Four best friends stepped into what seemed like just another ordinary night at a bowling alley in 1992. Laughter filled the lanes, secrets were shared over soda, and dreams about the future felt endless. But when the doors closed and the music faded, they never made it home. For over 2 decades, their disappearance haunted the town, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and silent grief. Then, 22 years later, a single overlooked detail from an old photograph reopens the mystery, a detail so small it had gone unnoticed, yet so chilling it changes everything. Wichita wore its neon like a second sky that September night of 1992, and the Starlight Bowl shone in it as a small constellation, all chrome edges and syrup light. The air inside was sweet with orange soda and lane oil, that mechanical perfume that clings to fingers and turns memory glossy. The speakers hummed the last of the 80s as if the decade refused to surrender, and beyond the glass, the Arkansas moved slow and dark, a patient listener sliding past warehouses and cottonwoods without comment. Pins collapsed in orderly thunder. The ceiling tiles held the day's heat and released it slowly, a faint breath that smelled of wax and old trophies. Bowling balls rested in their returns like planets cooling after long travel, and every so often a child laughed in the arcade. And the bell of the prize counter answered with a bright metallic chime. Somewhere a mop bucket drifted on its sea of water, leaving a crescent on the floor that looked just like new moon. No one else had noticed. They came as they always came. 4 pieces of the same bright laugh. Lena Marvin's arrived first and turned a napkin into a boat with 2 calm folds, then another, a small fleet gathering in the ashtray as if the table were a harbor no map admitted. She kept other people's worries in her pockets. Eli Booker followed with the steady roll of a planet in his palm, counting under his breath 1, 2, 3, up to 10, before every throw, as though courage could be measured and summoned by rhythm. Naomi Feld tied a pink bow, a beaded bracelet, tapping her wrist with soft weather, and on the pale inside of that wrist she had written the names of cities that were not yet roots but wishes. Gus Riley, teller of elaborate truths, touched the gutter edge with 2 fingertips before each release, a superstition inherited from a grandfather who blessed doors that way, and kept a harmonica in his jacket. They made a living out of small rituals. Lena straightened scorecards and sketched constellations around initials. Eli aligned the salt shaker with the napkin dispenser until the universe looked level. Naomi built cassettes like road maps. Gus swore he could read weather off the lanes. The jukebox chose a ballad that set candles where no candles were. In the far wall, a service door exhaled and settled again, the kind of door that sometimes stuck, sometimes breathed, a detail too ordinary to earn a thought. They made small bets for soda refills and bragging rights, and the game moved away. Good conversations move, circling an old joy and finding it new each time. Lena placed a paper boat into Eli's pocket for bravery and sent her ball skimming like a silver bird over dark water. Eli reached 10 and released and blushed under applause. Naomi, who swore she could smell rain through concrete, listened to her beads before stepping forward. Her ball went sure and straight, stubborn as a promise. Gus missed, laughed at himself, touched the gutter, and tried again. They talked about futures as if they could be written into being. Lena with a suitcase of paper sails and a camera. Eli with his own garage and a calendar that left Sundays clear. Naomi with a scholarship and a map filled in by postcards. Gus with a stage and 1 honest song. And there was, as there so often is before the world cracks, a photograph. Not tonight, not yet, but one taken a week earlier, when 2 classmates wandered in with a disposable camera and the flash turned everything into celebration. Arms over shoulders, denim softened by years, a bow like a memory of 4th grade. The picture lived in their minds like a lantern. Closing time softened the starlight. The neon in the window flickered like a tired star. The glossy floor returned. Footsteps as if the building could recognize them. They paid in quarters and tucked the scorecard as carefully as one tucks a receipt from happiness. Outside, the night had the smell of cut grass and warm tar, and the Arkansas slid by with the slow certainty of stories no one has yet told. A key turned. Doors thudded the warm, upholstered thud of faithful seats. Through open windows came Plan C. You next Wednesday, bring the Springsteen track. Don't forget the lucky coin. Call me if your mom needs a ride. Headlights braided their light on the asphalt, and someone made a promise that would outlive the night. The car eased out, the radio catching a station and holding it like a hand. They did not come home. Morning arrived flat and bright and full of ringing phones. Parents who knew ordinary worry met its older, heavier cousin. Officers stood in doorways and wrote everything down twice. The starlight offered what it could: receipts, the smell of oil, a bin of scuffed shoes, while the town offered rumor. The riverbanks were walked, ditches combed, the highway shoulders stared into until they stared back. Everywhere there were theories: a fight with strangers, a joyride too far, a runaway plan that forgot its own mercy. Nothing held. Days folded into months the way a flag is folded, careful hands, a ceremony nobody asked for. The investigation became a corridor lined with doors labeled maybe. Tips arrived like postcards from strangers. Most said nothing, and the rest said too much. People learned to carry the ache in a back pocket. The starlight kept its hours. The service door, sometimes stuck, sometimes breathing, continued to do the two things it knew, yet certain marks refused to fade away. A paper boat goes dusty but does not come apart. A bracelet keeps the shape of a wrist longer than metal has any right to remember. The lip of a gutter holds the memory of fingers. And a boy's counting 1 through 10 can become a town's. Quiet prayer when no other prayer will do. Time made its wide circle and returned wearing different shoes. In the spring of 2014, with the river low and the library humming about digitizing the past, June Caraway borrowed the good scanner and began feeding yearbooks and shoeboxes of snapshots to the patient light. She was a widow with the stamina of those who have learned the alphabet of absence, and she believed photographs were small rooms you could enter again. One envelope was labeled Street. She opened it, and the lantern of that weak early happiness slid onto the glass dot. At first, there was only the celebration at the center, a familiar brightness kept like a polished coin. Then the eye strayed left to the part of a picture where memory seldom bothers to look, and a sliver of hallway grew sharper than it had any right to be. A service door stood not closed but held ajar by a wedge of wood the size of a palm, and in the slope of fluorescent light a man's shoulder crossed the threshold, the fabric declaring thin stripes. Keys hung from his hand in a long chain, and at the end of that chain swung an oval tag stamped with 2 letters, small and stubborn. June leaned closer until the world was mostly breath and glass, and she said, very softly, "What is SF on that pendant?" June carried the picture like a pulse when she walked it into the station, and the station, which had learned to speak softly around old griefs, listened. Nora Hulley took the enlargement with the posture of someone who has spent years reading. Small print that refuses to confess at first glance. She was not tall, but she filled the room with attention. Her hair was gathered without ceremony, and a pencil waited behind one ear as if eager to draw a straight line through a tangle. She looked once, twice, then let the silence decide for her. And in the space after that silence, she called a number she kept for days exactly like this. Walt Dorsey answered as retirees often do, half suspicion, half relief that someone remembers the name, the history, the failure that will not lie flat. They met in an office whose window looked over the river like an apology. Walt arrived in an old jacket that still carried the ghost of pipe tobacco and his stubborn pride with the shine rubbed off. He teased the picture backward with a finger as if the paper could flinch and give up more. "SF," he said. "South Fork, cold storage. I have not missed that smell." Nora smiled a measured smile. "We're reopening formally, if you're willing to lend your memory." He shrugged, the kind of shrug that means yes in men who have learned to be careful with their words. "I'm willing to lend the mistakes." "Two," he said. They brought out the boxes that had learned every scent of the building. Damp winter, hot August, copier ink, the breath of the night custodian. The labels said 1992 in a hand that did not know it was writing for 2014. There were newspaper clippings, leaned up like tired soldiers, Polaroids whose whites had turned the color of tea, maps with corners softened by repetition. Nora pinned a sheet of paper to the corkboard and drew a grid with neat black squares. "Bingo," she said. "You laugh so the darkness doesn't choose the joke." In the squares, she wrote the theories that had been loved once and then were not. Fight in parking lot. Accident, secret runaway, rival kids, drugs, anything with UFO. Walt snorted. "Add bad coffee, that one keeps happening." He lifted the station pot, sipped, cursed with the elegance of a man raised by manners, and swallowed anyway. Nora grinned despite herself and made a tiny X in the corner of the square labeled bad coffee, as if crossing out pain with a child's pen could have power. The Starlight Bowl received them like a theater after the audience has gone home. The neon trembled but did not brag. The lanes were no longer mirrors. They were the color of every evening that had passed here and not been named. The shoe counter smelled of leather that had seen too much dance. In the arcade, one machine worked without sound, a mute constellation still insisting on play. They walked behind the lanes to where the pinsitters slept in their iron beds, each a cathedral of belts and arms and patient geometry. When the building exhaled, the machines answered with ticks and little groans, the song of old industry. The whole row thumped every now and then like the heart of a tired animal trying to keep dawn away. They followed the day, photograph suggestion, like it was a path drawn in chalk. Here was the service door, paint flaking like fish scales, the edge polished by hands that had learned it in the dark. The frame showed the faint bruise of a wedge, as if a small block had grown there and been removed with guilt. On the floor, a line of glossy smears ran thin as threads away from the lanes. Not random, but laid down by the consistent passage of something greased, the exact amber whisper of lane oil. Nora knelt into the smell of metal and solvent. "That's not traffic," she said. "That's habit." Walt leaned and nodded. "Habits make better roads than city planners," he said. They asked the manager to unlock what could be unlocked. The man apologized for the dust and for the 70s and for the way the place kept holding on. The basement door complained. With a wordless vowel, stairs went down into a cool, kept by concrete. Nora clicked her light and the beam reached out as if reading Braille in the air. Somewhere overhead a pin fell by accident and, so far from its purpose, sounded like china breaking. "You know," Walt said, "if they'd brewed that coffee any weaker, I could have read a newspaper through it." "You already read the passed through water," Nora answered, and if her voice sounded like a laugh, it was because fear and intelligence are cousins, and both need oxygen. Walls stared back blankly until one refused to. The hammer sang a shy note, and the plaster answered hollow. "This one has secrets," Walt said in the tone used for children who were hiding in plain sight. The manager, more worried about liability than ghosts, looked prepared to faint. "Nora," and Walt said about their slow mercy, tapping, listening, tracing cracks, following a stain that insisted on downward. The panel came away with a sigh not unlike the breath a room takes when a party ends, and behind it lay a corridor no map had. Admitted in years. The floor bore the same amber threads, thicker now, like handwriting growing desperate. On the left, a wooden wedge sat as carefully as a book returned to a library by someone who wanted to pretend the book had never left. They moved along the narrow back with patience, reading scuffs and old tape marks, stopping where the concrete had once been asked to point the way. There beneath dust was a painted arrow, its white bled into gray, but still sure of its voice. "DOCKS," it said. the words stretched by the stencil, each letter urgent as a finger. Walt unfolded an old fire diagram he had brought like contraband. His thumb found the coordinates almost happily. "There's our alphabet," he murmured. "Boliche to back corridor to dock alley." They stood in front of a machine that had not worked in years, its belt slack and asleep, a little lint of the world gathered on its cogs. Nora looked at the manager, who looked at the fuse panel with the dread of someone who has memorized every complaint the city can make. "Just a minute," he said. The breaker clacked like the opening of a small theater. The belt twitched, then turned with a reluctant yawn. The machine rumbled awake the way an animal might in winter, unhappy and dutiful. There was a scrap of sound, a rattle not in the score, and then something small leapt from the belt and struck the metal lip. With a tiny clatter that sounded exactly like a memory choosing its moment. It was a bracelet. Beaded, the red dark as a berry in shade. The elastic, dust-filmed, still shaped itself around air as if loyal to a wrist. Nora did not touch it at first. She let the fact of it breathe. Walt took off his hat, though he wore none. In the slowness after that, the machine let out a thin, metallic moan that might have been friction and might have been grief. "Naomi," Nora said, not as a question, but as one says the name of a town one has finally reached. The manager swallowed, crossed himself in a habit he'd forgotten he had, and turned the power off so quickly the silence boomed. Certainty did not arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like cold, steady, and unarguable. Something had happened here. Something had been taught to look ordinary. They bagged the bracelet with the gentleness that belongs at hospital beds, and while the paper sealed, the room changed temperature as rooms do when a story finally admits its first true sentence. Nora traced the oil threads to a seam of door and felt with her palm what the eye could not see. The echo of a latch moved too many times by a hand that preferred not to be seen. She found, lodged in a crack, a sliver of wood shaved from a wedge, the cousin to the block by the wall. Walt stood back, assembling the picture with the peculiar dignity of men who know they are late and refuse to be sloppy. "From here," he said, "you could move anything that rolls. Lanes to backs, backs to docks. You could do it quietly enough that laughter would cover it." They climbed into daylight with the bracelet like a lantern they were not yet allowed to raise. Paperwork created its small, necessary music. Nora called records and permits and the city's memory, which is to say the people who have not moved away. South Fork Cold Storage appeared in a ledger with entries scratched at inconvenient times: night service, after hours, contract keys not returned promptly. There were names that looked borrowed and one initialed R, but Nora put a pin where speculation wanted applause and waited instead for evidence. When afternoon sloped toward evening, they stood again at the back of the starlight and followed the painted word outward, past the dumpsters that had learned a century of weather, into the alley, where deliveries once rehearsed their precise choreography. Walt opened his map, the old paper sounding like dry leaves. He drew a line with his nail, connecting the corridor's probable end to the freight mouth, then farther to the rectangle marked holding basin, then farther still to the neat label. "Maple Bridge. If you want to hide a sin," he said in a voice that did not keep the sermon out, "let the river pray for you." They walked the route as one walks the steps of a house remembered from childhood, turning where air told them to, stopping where weeds changed their mind. The river spoke in its low evening register, that steady baritone that forgives everything except the truth. Beneath the bridge, the concrete showed its veins, and the silt held small archives of careless years' bottle caps, a toy tire, a rusted clasp. Nora's light searched patiently over the ground that water had taught to forget, crossed a rib of broken curb, and then, just under the lip where shade stays longest, the beam fell across two faint arcs, side by side, blacker than the rest, curving into the basin like signatures. Old tire marks, washed thin by seasons yet refusing disappearance, lay there under Maple Bridge. Morning came to Maple Bridge, the color of old coins, the wind cutting clean through the culverts so that caution tape hummed and the silt showed its bruises. City crews in orange vests lowered the basin with pumps that throbbed like a second heartbeat. A hook truck idled with cable coiled tight. Clipboards made small weather of paper. Nora and Walt stood where the shade kept a little night, watching the water step back and reveal the stains time leaves on concrete when it thinks no one is looking. Two faint arcs waited just where they had seen them, twin parentheses of rubber. Shadow that grew sharper as the current let go. A foreman pointed to a darker pane in the shallows where eddies clung despite the wind. That's your hollow. The hook went down, feeling among bottle caps and river keys, missed, tried again. Then bit, the truck leaned. Bubbles rose in a stubborn round, and the Arkansas, polite as always, made room. People edged closer without meaning to, the way crowds do when the present prepares to become history and no one wants to blink. The Chevy Caprice surfaced wrapped in weeds, an old animal blinking at daylight. Algae laced the grill. A strand of hydrilla trailed the emblem. Mud poured from door seams in slow beards. Workers steadied the swing with gloved hands. Nora kept her voice small and practical. Doors creaked. The air that came out smelled like a cellar, iron and water and time. Seats wore a scatter of sand. The glove box held ordinary lives, pen, matchbook, a receipt for soda. No bodies. The car had been made to look like an accident you could believe. From a distance dot in the back, two steel barrels waited, paint scabbed to islands. Empty now except for the glitter a brine leaves when it dries. Their half-eaten labels still insisted in capital certainty. South Fork, brine. Beneath, numbers marked lot. Batch, date like an alibi written for an audience that had learned to distrust. The trunk had the tidy look of intention. River mud refuses neatness. This was washed in careful fans, beginning in places the river could not start. On the carpet, a pale smear of yellow grease shone under the light, the old butter color that freight elevators wear on their rails. On the dash, a cassette had fossilized in the radio's mouth. Nora worked it free. The radio sighed. Plastic slid into an evidence bag with a dry leaf crackle. She left it unplayed. The wind cut clean. The day made promises. A patient answer deserved a patient room. Walt cleared his throat and, because. A little humor is a kind of handrail, told about the summer 3 stolen bicycles were found sleeping on the roof of City Hall. Teenagers, a dare, a town relieved enough to laugh. Cause of loss, he said, gravity optional. The workers smiled, and the grimness blinked and stepped back half a pace. They dismantled the obvious gently. Accident? The Caprice bore no honest signature of a dive, no crumpled plate, no shattered headlight toward the flow, no torn nose reading. The direction of impact? Flight? Nothing in the cabin argued haste. Prank? Pranks do not borrow brine barrels or scrub trunks until the dirt forgets how to be dirt. Someone staged this, Nora said. Someone set it down for us like a photograph. Walt tapped the barrels and borrowed props from South Fork to do it. Back at the table of ledgers, the barrels learned to speak. The serial stamp, reluctant at first, yielded. Auxiliary containers repurposed in 1991. South Fork cold storage, pulled for night work. A maintenance log surfaced with 4 entries at hours that treated midnight like a rumor, all signed the same. Narrowway, O'Rourke. The name drew stripes in the mine shirt fabric. Keys swinging, the small oval pendant in the old photograph. Supply records placed those barrels at the alley the Starlight used for deliveries. The cassette went to the lab, where a patient tangle of wires unlearned the river. Nora wore headphones while a technician coaxed seconds open. Snow first, the soft roar of the universe shrunk to a hand's breadth, then a thin, far wail that could be siren or memory trying to dress itself. Then, bright as a coin on tile, metal striking metal, precise. Then the short scrape of something guided along rails, and under that a threadbare whir, like a winch track beginning to take weight. And finally, a small caged echo, the sound, a caged echo, the sound, a sound. Room makes when it is built to be closed. 7 seconds only, and the shape of a machine hiding in sound. They laid old schematics on the table until the building turned into language. A brochure once proud of efficiency showed the two freight bays and the cage elevator that served them, a gate that collapsed into itself with quick metallic clatter, rails fed with yellow grease. Walt held his thumb up, the grease from the caprice carpet, still shining faintly, and the diagram and the smear and the tape agreed with one another like witnesses who do not know they are telling the same truth. The photograph's oval pendant, with its two letters SFA stopped being a charm and became an address. Hypotheses took their numbered tickets and were called in turn, then dismissed. Accident lacked courage here, flight lacked motive, prank lacked reason, only staging fit the room. Someone had used South Fork's throat to swallow 4 young lives and then arranged a convincing lie beneath Maple Bridge. The judge, who had watched the case grow old, signed the warrant with the care of someone returning a lost name to its owner. Evening tilted blue. Nora and Walt drove in a silence that meant the same thing to both of them. Chain link greeted them with weeds and a padlock that had learned patience. The cutter bit and the lock cried out like metal, remembering it used to sing. Inside, the corridor tasted of salt and dust. A safety poster peeled itself slowly from cinder block. Metal shelves carried dust the way some men carry regret. At the far end, a pair of freight doors waited with the humility of machines that once did honest work. Between them, a scissor gate sat folded and wired off, and along the seam between doors, a welding seam puckered like an old scar. Nora's light combed that seam. It said nothing. Walt set a lantern on the floor and opened a toolbox. The small clinks of wrenches sounded like a promise a building could understand. The first spark stitched bright letters into the dark. The weld spat, resisted, surrendered. Dust rose in a patient congregation. The gate unfolded with an arthritic grace, metal scissoring itself thin. Air rose from below with the cellars. Cold on it, iron in its breath. A smell like winter kept in jars. They stood side by side in that thin music. Nora lifted the lantern, and its light swung in a slow arc and poured over the lip, falling into the black mouth of the shaft that had been sealed in 1993 and had waited all these years without blinking. The beam kept going, softer and softer, as if even light needed to take a breath before learning what the dark had saved. The shaft kept its own weather, a cold that rose in a slow, careful breath, smelling of iron and old salt, as if winter had been locked there and taught to wait. When the gate finally folded back and the weld gave up its stubborn grammar, the dark beneath looked less like absence and more like a room that had chosen not to speak. Nora held the lantern as one holds a name, and the light went down a few feet, then a few more, washing the walls where grease had hardened into amber seams. The concrete wore a tide line, years written in dust, and along one rail the yellow smear of elevator grease had the same tired shine as the mark they'd found in the caprice. The color of butter in a dish no one refills anymore. South Fork revealed itself one quarter at a time. Cold tiles the color of hospital walls. A drift of salt sewn into grout rusted the corners like dried blood watered down by time. On pegboards hung hooks that remembered aprons. On shelves, labels gone the color of tea whispered of brine and batch and night shift. In an office that still smelled faintly of copy toner, a clock had stopped at a number no one trusted. The place remembered being busy and did not mind admitting it. When the elevator's chain twitched in some leftover sympathy, every hallway gave back a small echo, like the remnant chorus of an old turn of work. They lowered a camera first, then themselves, cautious as chapel steps. The cage floor had become a shallow bowl of silt and hardware. In the gritty yellow of the lantern, 3 arrangements appeared in the distance the way constellations appear if you are patient. Parts of lives that had been asked to hold still too long. Bones lay in the order gravity prefers ribs like collapsed. Fans, arms folded by necessity, but the story in them was not kind. The wrists showed the bright line where wire or plastic had bitten and then been forgiven by decades. Near one set of ribs, a harmonica lay bent as if it had tried to remember a note and failed. Near another, a keychain with its oval pendant missing, the little split ring twisted out of shape. At the edge of the pit, a brittle seal from a barrel red lacquer flaked to pink-capped, the circle of something that had once promised closure. No one spoke for the time it takes a heart to reconsider. Walt took his hat off, though he was not wearing one, and stood the way men do when they are counting the distances between fathers and sons. Nora felt the room tip slightly as truths adjusted themselves into place. She marked the positions, photographed with care, made the calls you make when the past becomes a room you can step into. Medical examiner, crime scene, the quiet chain of duty that runs like a cable under any town. 3, she said softly, because numbers need to be said out loud to become real. The air pressed closer. Above them, the building rustled in a way that could have been weather and could have been memory. It was the column by the west wall. That changed everything not yet changed. The paint there had been scratched by a tool, both soft and stubborn. The letters were thin, their edges bruised rather than carved, the way metal writes when asked to be a pencil. Nora wiped dust gently, and the word resolved out of the abrasion: Arcade East Side. The dash was long and almost angry, dragged through paint like a breath pulled too far. A coin lay a hand's length away, its rim nicked, its face salted. To anonymity. The message had waited in that dry air for 22 years with the patience of someone who believes in rescue. They came up into the daylight with the silence of people carrying a body even when their hands are empty. The city, which has its own ears, heard quickly. Phones traveled from one kitchen to another, from break rooms to checkout counters, from the stoop on a block where heat keeps the day from closing. Families were told what could be told. A mother sat down on a porch step and watched her neighbor's hydrangea pretend it was an ocean. A father, who had learned to address his grief only on Sundays, placed his palm against a wall and spoke a name into paint. The town did what towns do when breath is taken from them and given back as a stone. It held still. Back inside, South Fork's ghosts were made to testify. Records waited where paper always waits, in drawers that stick, in boxes whose lids sag. Nora and Walt found a ledger that did not belong to any official book numbers, that paired with no invoice, entries made in a hand nervous about witnesses. On Fridays, well past midnight, someone had signed out hours for maintenance, and the initials at the end were lean and tidy in their lie. OR, a yellowed notice from 1989. Congratulated the facility on partnering with the Starlight to host overflow from a newly renovated room, Arcade East, its letters fat with optimism. A memo tucked into a manual mentioned cabinet storage, temp at docks until pickup, and an ex-employee tracked down to a small house that smelled of axle grease and cut grass, rubbed his jaw and said, yes, sometimes they kept pinballs and cabinets overnight, and yes, it was usually a man in stripes who arranged it. And no, he had never seen a permit with the city seal. That fellow moved funny toward the end, the man added. Walked like stairs had argued with him. Hospital records, the kind that survive because bureaucracy loves itself, told another slant. In the spring of 1993, an Owen Rook was admitted overnight after a fall from stairs, bruised ribs, a cut along the forearm clean as language. He was discharged and did not return. He stopped appearing in payroll, then stopped appearing at all. Walt, who could smell usefulness like coffee, pried open a metal cabinet whose padlock had rusted for show only. Inside, a cardboard box that had once carried copier paper held manuals, with exploded diagrams and precise warnings in 3 languages. Beneath them, a folded map slept. Unfurled, the old emergency plan was both smug and innocent. Corridors printed in calm blue, exits marked with thick green arrows that assumed the world would be kind enough to remain a diagram. Along the east wall of the arcade, next a stairwell, was drawn the kind of service stairs that do not want applause, a narrow mouth to a side door on the street. Walt traced the line with a knuckle. There, he said, not loud, as if not to wake anything that didn't want to be woken. If a person were small and desperate and the door were not locked, that would be the way the world stays open. The map turned the room on its axis. Suddenly, the scratched word on the column was not only a message to the living above. It was a compass for the dying below, a letter to a future that might include rescue. Nora felt something inside her sit up, the thin animal that kept her believing in late answers. She walked the route in her mind, pit to column, column to corridor, corridor to arcade, arcade to that stingy stair, stair to air. She remembered a paper fleet of boats gathering on a table, the kind a girl makes without thinking, the way other girls twirl hair or chew pens. She remembered a bracelet of beads that had waited inside a machine and a keychain without its oval name. She remembered the joke-bent harmonica that had not played in 2 decades. The shape of absence rearranged itself. One space remained. They did what work asks in its long hours. Labeled, photographed, logged, and waited while a city rediscovered its whispers. Walt said almost gently that he had once spent 3 months looking for a sign that turned out to be a hand-painted arrow on a chicken coop. He wasn't sure whether that meant hope was foolish or that it had a sense of humor. Nora smiled with the one corner of her mouth that belonged to Mercy. Then she took her chair at the computer where databases stacked themselves into a kind of cathedral and began to cross names against names missing against found. Wichita against the counties that touch its weather. Kansas against Oklahoma, where the river's syllables repeat themselves and end with a sigh. There is a particular stillness. That happens when the right record opens, the way a deck of cards hushes when the one you asked for slides toward you. On a page without romance, a line of unadorned type wrote itself into the room. Female. Unknown. Admitted 1993. TULSA. Notes. Temporary amnesia. Healing laceration forearm. Behavioral. Folds napkins into boats. All the time. Nora read it once. Then again. Then pressed her hands flat on the table as if anchoring herself to an ordinary world that had just made space for a miracle. The habit had traveled intact through shock and naming and distance. Because some parts of us refuse to abandon ship. She looked at Walt, whose face had become a map of roads that had been waiting too long to be driven, and he looked back with the careful hope of men who have learned not to frighten good news. A number waited in the corner of the screen. She dialed it with the patience of someone drawing breath for a long swim. The ring sounded like a hallway she had already walked in her mind. When the line clicked and a woman answered with the wary courtesy of those who have had to build themselves from scratch, Nora said, her voice low and warm as a blanket left on a chair, "Ma'am, we need to talk about an old memory." The road to Tulsa unspooled like a ribbon that had been kept in a drawer since the 90s, creased, a little sun-faded at the edges, but still willing to tie 2 places together if asked with kindness. Cottonwoods leaned in to gossip with the car windows. Wheat stubble glinted like small coins in the morning light. Far off, the Arkansas kept repeating its name under bridges as if practicing an answer no one had found the right question for. Walt took the wrong exit once, then again, and when Nora arched an eyebrow, he said he had done it to give the hard time to catch up with the evidence, which is how some men apologize without dimming the day. The radio offered a hymn that had once been a pop song, the kind that sticks to your hands, and they drove inside it, each thinking of their own unfinished letters. Nora about a boy with her last name who had driven into night and never come. Back out, Walt about a room he left years ago with the light still on. They stopped for coffee at a counter where the chrome had learned everyone's face and a waitress called strangers by names that fit. The coffee was good enough to be an argument against despair, and on the table, the napkin dispenser shone like a small lighthouse. Nora slid a napkin free and folded it once, twice. A plain square turned into a soft keel, then set it down without comment. Walt smiled into his cup in a way that meant both blessing and luck. The road straightened itself and they took it. The shelter had a name that tried to sound like a verb. Hope House, Safe Harbor, one of those honest nouns that volunteers turned into action, and it smelled of laundry and a thrift store cedar that had learned 100 winters. The woman who opened the door for them wore a life that had been mended without hiding the seams. She was not young and not old. Her hair kept back with a care that had learned itself in small mirrors. The file called her Ruth Calder now, a name chosen like a coat from a rack, serviceable, warm, no history stitched inside. She invited them into a common room where a plant minded its green business and a clock was professionally kind. While she waited for them to decide whether they wanted tea, her hands, independent and calm, reached for a napkin and began to fold, not showing off, not even thinking, a boat taking shape in the time it takes to ask how you take your sugar. Nora felt the world tip the way a dream does when it is about to admit it was a memory all along. They spoke as people do when there is a door they both see and do not wish to rush. Nora told the short version first, that a photograph had remembered. A detail that a building had given up its stubborn silence, that the town had taken a breath it had saved for 2 decades. Ruth listened with the delicate attention of someone who has learned to carry a cup so full it must be watched. When Nora used the name Starlight, Ruth's eyes moved not to the detective but to the window, as if some small weather had tapped. There, Walt, who knew when to make a room wider, asked after the plant and the volunteer calendar, and whether the coffee here could forgive the sins of a station pot. Ruth laughed, and the laughter was a bridge the conversation could cross without looking down. Nora placed 3 things on the table as one lays out tools for a gentle repair: a fresh napkin, a coin she had rubbed clean until the year shone, and a pair of headphones tied to those 7 patient seconds restolen from the river. "We only do this if you want," she said, a promise spoken as instruction. Ruth nodded and touched the coin, turned it once in the light, then put on the headphones and shut her eyes. The tape did what it had done in the lab. Snow, a far cry. That might be siren or might be a memory dressing itself, metal's bright syllable, a winch murmur, a cagey echo. Her shoulders flinched not at the cry, but at the little coin-on-metal sound, like a quarter crossing a grate. She took off the headphones slowly, set them down with both hands, as if sound could break like china. "What do you smell?" Nora asked, and Ruth surprised herself first, then them, by saying, "Cold. But the kind that comes out of a door, not the sky. And oil, a sweet oil that sticks to skin." She pressed her palm against her upper arm and then, without instruction, lifted the coin and drew it along the napkin in a slow, clumsy line, the paper resisting, the coin cutting soft. Letters tried to stand and sit down at the same time. A-R, Kia. The last curve trembled and would not finish. Ruth blinked fast. "Sometimes I dream a word I cannot finish," she said. "In the dream, my hands are not my hands. They are sore. There is grit. I am telling someone where the air lives." They took the dream seriously. Nora spread out photographs not of bones or gates, but of the starlight in daylight lanes asleep under evening blue. The shoe counter with its friendly exhaustion, a corner of the arcade where a stencil had once declared the east side the fun side. She described the way the jukebox pulled songs out of muscle memory, and how a girl with a pink bow laughed like a bell, learning a second language. She spoke of a boy who counted under his breath, a boy who blessed the gutter, a bracelet that kept time with a wrist. Ruth's hands, which had forgotten and remembered enough to distrust both verbs, opened, closed, opened again. She cried without knowing why. "Do you want us to stop?" Nora asked, and Ruth shook her head no, like a person stepping carefully from one rock to the next in a shallow river. "Someone with a ribbon," Ruth said at last, not searching for color because the color arrived on its own, pushed, and not mean, the way you push a child toward a door when smoke is in a room. There was a space too small to deserve the name of door. There was a sound like a cage folding itself. She said a name, Lena, and then the ceiling tipped. I think there were 3. I think the cold was not weather. I think I am a coward." Nora reached across the table, not to erase what had been said, but to stand close to it. "Cowards do not write arrows for strangers," she said. "Cowards sleep. You carved letters. That isn't sleeping." Ruth laughed again, the quick self-forgiving kind, and touched the spot on her shoulder that the old medical note had recorded, a bruise pattern, compatible with fall through a narrow opening, the sort of clinically accurate kindness that has to live in hospitals so other kinds of kindness can live everywhere else. The same record had contained a strange line patient report smell of ice and oil, which had been a riddle until the South Fork's breath answered it. Walt suggested they eat before the day did something foolish to their sugar, and in the car afterward he missed a turn by design. "Just letting the heart keep time," he said, and Ruth surprised herself by correcting him. "It is the breath that keeps time. The heart tells stories." He looked delighted to be scolded into poetry. The world felt slightly more bearable, which is what good small humor is for. The work that seems cold, but is only careful, threaded itself through the afternoon. Nora called the lab 2 counties over and secured what the living can offer the dead. A swab from a cheek, a signature on a form, a yes that recognizes grief as a family member. Families met them under light that tried to be ordinary, hands on tabletops, voices flattened so words would not crack. The remains from the shaft accepted names like water accepts a shape. Naomi Feld, bracelets and beads answering quietly. Eli Booker, the long bones of a mechanic's patience. Gus Riley, a harmonica that would not play again even if the air begged. The confirmations did not solve anything and solved everything. The town closed 3 doors and stood in the hall waiting to hear footsteps behind a 4th. Ruth sat with them while the calls went out. Eyes on the plant that had decided to thrive despite fluorescent light, hands learning a boat again as if it were a prayer you could hold. "I have carried a fear that I stole my own name," she said. "I do not know where I put it." "Sometimes names walk ahead so they can hold the door," Nora said, and Walt added that he had once written his own on the back of his hand so he would be sure to introduce himself properly to his wife when nerves were loud. Ruth smiled without apology. When the sun turned the shelter windows to soft coins, Nora asked the question that had been waiting all day like a suitcase by the door. "Would you come with us to Wichita?" Ruth looked at the boat in her palm and the coin on the table, and at the way the word on the napkin had run out of courage at the last letter. "Yes," she said, the kind of yes a person says to a room that never stopped wanting her in it. She lifted the paper boat as if measuring its weatherworthiness. "I left a sign for someone to find me," she added, half to herself, half to the girl with the ribbon, half to the corridor that had learned to be a lighthouse the hard way. Evening received them when they arrived, that familiar Kansas dusk, the color of a washed denim jacket, gentle around the corners. They did not drive straight to South Fork with its iron breath. They drove to the Starlight first, because some places need to go before others in the alphabet of return. The parking lot kept the heat of the day like a secret it had agreed to share. Neon trembled to life and laid pink on the windows as if placing a hand there. Ruth stood with her boat in her palm, not stepping forward yet, listening for a laughter she almost knew. The handle was cool from shade and faithful from years. When she pushed, the door opened for her as if it had been holding its breath since 1992. The Starlight received her like a place remembers the shape of a hand, the door easing open on hinges that had learned patience, the lanes breathing out that sweet, steady perfume of oil and wax in old triumph. She stood just inside as if listening for footsteps she herself had left behind, and when she moved, it was not toward spectacle, but toward the familiar. The scorched line where a spill had once been mopped into a moon, the shoe counter with its faded sizes, the arcade corner where a stencil still insisted the east side was the fun side. Nora and Walt kept a respectful distance, asking only the questions that fit in a whisper. "Take us through," Nora said, and the woman Ruth to the present, something else to the past, nodded with the small courage people use when the day is heavy and must still be lifted. It begins, she said, with the kind of laughter a person wears like a scarf because the night has the right temperature for it. It begins with a song the jukebox picks without being asked, and with a ball rolling true, and with a promise that will be believed forever because it is spoken uninjured. It begins with ordinary. She walked to the service hall where paint had flaked into fish scales and laid her palm there, and the skin remembered what the voice had not, the cool from a door that made cold instead of feeling it, a breath that tasted of brine and iron. They were moving machines, she said, and the word machines was not unkind, only exact. Slot cabinets wrapped against eyes, coin mechs in burlap, bolts in coffee cans, all the unattended music of a side business that asked night to pretend it was a friend. A man in stripes with a chain of keys and 2 silent helpers. The wedge under the door, a gate that folded itself like a prayer with metal syllables. We were in the way, she said, and the corridor said it could solve that. Eli counted, and at 7 he lost the number because fear is the 5th element and the only one that rearranges mathematics. Gus made himself wider and failed at physics and succeeded at love. He put himself between and took a shove that might have been meant for the air. Naomi's bracelet caught where belts keep their promises. The machine made a sound like breath in a bottle, and then the brighter cry of metal corrected by force. The beads leaped, and still, even now, the wrist seemed to live inside the circle the elastic kept. Lena, she said the name like a thread. Pulled through cloth pushed me toward light that did not deserve the name, toward a slice in the world where a stair was pretending to be a wall. Go, she said, and her mouth made the shape, and her eyes made the shape, and her hands spelled it into my shoulders. There was a coin. It was my coin or hers, I do not know. It was the building's coin because the building needed me to remember. She dragged the edge along paint and wrote the one word that would still be legible when the rest of us forgot ourselves. Arcade, east. The E trembled as if it knew the wind would have to hold it up. In telling. Corridors shortened so that we could survive them, and the old dead space learned to be a hallway again. The gate clacked. The cold unrolled. A foot found a rung, and then air, and then a landing that had waited for a body small enough to deserve its safety. Behind, the arched noises of a fight that had no choreography, the grunt and scrape of fear-finding tools, the harsh cinder song of a cabinet corner against tile, a keyring's quick argument with gravity. Somewhere in those sounds a man in stripes learned how a stare can be a verdict, and he fell, and he rose, and he dragged his hurt into the year that would discharge him from a hospital onto a road without witnesses. The river had already been given its assignment. The caprice under Maple Bridge, she spoke of it the way one speaks of a photograph. You trust until you don't, had been cleaned where rivers do not clean, filled with barrels that had once held brine. Lowered as softly as a lie and left to tell a story that a town could sleep beside. The cassette in the dash carried the small theater of the scheme, the cage gate stuttering shut, the pinch of rail grease, a siren somewhere else. Staging is only kindness for a coward, Walt said softly, and she nodded as if he had named weather. Evidence finally fit together. Barrel numbers, the oval tag marked SF, the grease stains matching elevator rails. The judge signed the order, the warehouse opened, and the shaft gave back its truth. 3 names, Naomi Feld, Eli Booker, Gus Riley, returned to their families, spoken with care. Painful but healing dot at Maple Bridge, paper boats carrying there. Names drifted on the Arkansas, fragile but determined, like forgiveness learning to float. Walt watched in silence, knowing silence was the right language. Nora marked her last square, arcade on the card that had carried the case. Then came Ruth, once Lena, holding a folded napkin like a fragile bridge to the past. Her voice trembled but carried. She remembered the cold door, the striped man's whistle, and the word arcade scratched to be found. When she finally spoke Lena's name, the town exhaled after 22 years of holding its breath. Life resumed in small ways. Kitchens with radios on, the starlight's neon blinking again, doors watched and trusted. And as the river carried the last of the paper boats into the dark, Wichita felt the hinge of grief loosen and learned, slowly, to live again.